Well, now it works. Well, is it on Queen 10? All right. You're good. Chat good. Okay. So let me show you exactly where this sort of came from. I mentioned that I recognize this hand because Tim and I have been working together. So what we did yesterday was use a filter for out of position pre-flop raise pots. And what we did was basically take small blind, big blind, and cut off button, I think, were the two main ones we did. And I would look at the cards after I set the filter for fold. I think you should be able to see me now. Um, I would set the filter for check fold. And because I have it for check fold, I can see every single hand real quick matched up with the flop texture to be able to get a better understanding for whether or not I thought that hand should be folded. Basically, the gist of it was to find leaks as quickly as possible with his check folding strategy. So this was one of the ones that came up. And the reason I noted it is because I think this hand is close to a mixed strategy in theory, but I think it's definitely not a fold in practice because I know this texture specifically to be a hot spot for people overfolding versus check raise and also people stabbing too wide. So I think I said that I think this is a check raise greater than check called greater than check fold spot. You decided to check call in practice. Check call turn. Did you end up check ripping this? So why is this in the 100 BB hand history? Let me reload these. That hand we said was a fold though. Um, oh yeah, you're right, you're right. So it wasn't going highest down to lowest. All right, so let's talk about this one then because I think it's a subtle. There's a couple of subtle data points that I think lean it toward a fold. In order to find them, we've got to go back to the flop. We talked about this hand for a while, I think. So by the turn, it's like a clear check call, no two ways about it. And then by the river, in theory, it's like a slam dunk check call. Do you remember what your thought process was initially that you said was making you want to call? Like, was there any consideration at all in terms of whether or not this hand could be considered to be folded? Because I don't think a theory-oriented player would consider it like one bit, because you're so high up in your range. Oh yeah, yeah, that was the main thing that you seemed to be focused on was that for some reason Tim's attention went to the fact that he was very concerned that the villain might perceive his 9x region to be weak. And that was the main reason why he felt like he needed to make sure he was defending enough on this board. So there's a couple ways we could go with this, but I think the best way is to expose that when there's an when there's too much attention put on protecting your own range, there's going to be a bias or a distortion created in how vulnerable that portion of your range actually is. Like, realize that when Tim looks at this board and he sees my 9x is very vulnerable, therefore I think I should defend here often enough, he's actually projecting his own thoughts and feelings onto the villain, where the villain might not even be thinking that same way. The villain might think that Tim folded most of his low pocket pairs and that Tim might not even have all that much 9x to begin with. Once the villain bet the turn, I mean. Um, so when I hear something like that, it's too contracted. It's not rooted in anything data oriented. So I tend to chalk it up to being too assumptive in general for me to put any sort of real like stock in. Like I'm not going to base a decision off of something that I can tell is clearly coming from the way I interpret the game and projecting that onto the villain. Instead, I want to look for something that's more empirically rooted and something data driven. So here, what we ended up saying was that the two main data points that significantly lower the probability that he can have enough bluffs on this river are the fact that the turn and the river are Broadway driven. Like they're both Broadway cards, and cutoffs range, buttons range versus cutoff open is substantially geared toward Broadway holdings. Yeah, he can have stuff like 8-7, 7-6 suited, ace-3, ace-4, ace-5 suited, but in the land of turn plus river runoffs, this one is probably up in the top 80 or 90th percentile with connecting with his initial flop bluffing range. It connects too many of his backdoors. Queen 10, Queen Jack, King 10, Jack 10 all got there. So in PO Unlocked Pack 2, I introduced this concept as sort of base rate of bluffs, meaning that at any given time, you can assess the base rate of bluffs that your opponent gets to the river with. And this river would be a below average river in terms of us being able to justify bluff catching because more of his bluffs completed on a king than they would have on, say, a 6. So it's kind of a basic way of thinking about it, but the beauty of it is it's actually rooted in some of the most hardcore data that you can get, which is Bayesian. I never know if I pronounce this word right. Is it Bayesian or Bayesian? Chat can correct me. But basically what Bayesian says is that the less bluffs that the villain actually has in his range to look down at, the more likely it is that he's not going to be over bluffing in that spot. For instance, if a higher distribution of his range on the river is composed of bluffs, then there's more of a chance that he fires a bluff on the river because he's just looking down at more of them. It's easier for him to basically blow his frequencies out of the water. So when you get these types of runoffs that should be sort of a red flag to you, that it's getting hard for him to have enough bluffs unless we're willing to put him in a super aggro profile from pre-flop all the way through flop turn river. And that's viable, but we have to sort of put it in its place. What we can start to say is that in order for this guy to have enough bluffs by the river, he had to be the type of player who was stabbing wide to begin with suited ace-x hands in his range pre-flop, or 8-7, 7-6 suited, 5-4 suited pre-flop, ace-10 off that decided to go stab, stab, stab. Basically, it gets harder to put a high confidence on him being the type of profile that he would need to be in order for us to have a super plus EV call here, or even like a significantly plus EV call. It's much harder to assign him as that type of player profile on this specific run out. So when we're creating a confidence interval for profiling him, we have to sort of account for the other end of the spectrum, which is the guys that don't even have the ace-x suited in their hand in their range to call pre-flop, or the guys that check them back on the flop, the guys that don't use over-aggression on the stab, the guys that would have given up the turn, the guys that if they did barrel the turn would give up river too often because they perceived him to be well protected in this type of river. So all those type of things are not like concrete, but this is what using offensive vision is. It's finding extra data points, however subtle they may be, to support that it's better off, you're better off using them than ignoring them completely. And sometimes we get combinations of runouts, like in this case I think it's a really good one, where the data points are intensified to such an extent that you can actually say this is a clear fold, even though if you looked in Solver it would never fold this. Well, Solver's going out of its way to turn every single hand into a bluff that it needs to remain well balanced. The other thing we didn't mention is like another profile that would make this more of a call is if this guy was like capable of turning pocket 3s, 4s, 5s into bluffs, over like 3 streets. But that's a very, very rare breed of player, so it doesn't make up much of the spectrum for me. Question in the chat, Johnny C says, if we check raise this hand, do we want to play a polarized bet on the turn with a big sizing or a smaller one, 33%? I think you have a choice. Solver would use both. It would mix them. If you did use only a 1/3 sizing, you would see that barrels turn at a high frequency because its check raise range, I think, would be more linear driven on this flop. And it would also have overpairs too. So it's at a huge range advantage basically. So I think it would use a 2/3 sizing like fairly often, but I think it would still balance a 1/3. As far as what I would do in practice, it would be more exploitatively geared. Since I know that people substantially overfold on 9 deuce deuce rainbow, I'm much more likely to shut down in the turn unless a card peels that I think I can point out puts a lot of pressure on his solver suggested defense frequencies to the turn. Like for instance, if this guy's going to have a lot of pocket pairs that float the flop check raise and then a king or a queen hits the turn, that's a spot where I actually might barrel naked because I know that the environment probably doesn't float that much queen x or king x versus the flop check raise, and that they probably overfold their middling pocket pair because that's just the paradigm that most players are in. It's like I'll call and fold on bad turns, or I'll call and continue on good turns. So there's an element of psychology that you can sort of add in to balance this data point stuff, and it's something that I'm looking at when I'm basically trying to find the most accurate response to a spot where I know we're moving away from the model, but I also want to make sure I'm not so assumptive as to say that like, well, of course they fold pairs here because it's an overcard. Like I'm not just doing it like that. I'm submerging myself in forums to see that this is how the psychology of the community basically works, and then I'm also running filters like, well, what happens on an overcard in these types of boards? Do they actually fold too much? And I'm getting feedback that says they do. So very little of what I do at this point is actually my opinion. And that's why I said, I think in October, I said something like, I don't really have opinions in poker anymore. I have assumptions that I think are more data driven than not, but I'm constantly open to them being proven wrong because I see no reason to hold on to anything so rigidly. It only hurts my accuracy in the long run. So for the time being, I think that the stats we have are pretty good because they allow me to see over large trials that certain things are going on certain textures. Players are overfolding in certain spots, and I can compare that to the PO subset frequency, which I trust because I trust the solver. So none of that really seems like it's standing the chance of being overturned anytime soon. What I do think will happen in the future is that we'll plow deeper and deeper into the subtleties and maybe get larger sample sizes. Hey Ahmad, welcome to the chat. Jedi Mind Tricks asked, are you checking flop 100% out of position here, Nick? Yeah, it's something that I talked about in the October streams. It's something that I credited all the way back to Tyler Forrester when he joined Run It Once. The gist of it, well, I'll tell you what his gist of it was because I think it's still very valid. He was looking for a way to simplify his strategy and also find sort of more precision in the exploits of his part of the game tree that he had studied very well. So the arguments that came in versus him were like, okay, Tyler, well, if you check range here, then you're sacrificing some EV. And what he would say is, yeah, but I understand this part of the game tree well enough that I'm actually going to make it back because I know where the opponents are imbalanced themselves and I know how to maximally exploit that on turns and rivers. So that's a really good point. The reason I do it is I think much more intensely for the initial simplification of it, because especially when I'm training with it, I don't like to see guys bloat pots out of position with too wide of a c-bet range. I think it's the main way that they end up leaking post-flop. I think we touched on this in the October streams, but like if there's one thing, like maybe I have 3 main pillars to my entire training system. The first you have to understand is that most of the mistakes that get made in poker, period, I don't care if you look small stakes through high stakes, are from out of position, not properly protecting the checking range. So that's the first. And I'm huge on that because it's why I stab so much. Like, if out of position doesn't protect the checking range, it massively incentivizes aggressive stabbing strategies, which massively simplifies in position's game tree, because all of his mixed strategy hands on the flop just go towards stabs. So I want it for that reason. I think that it's simple, and it also eliminates the main weak of guys c-betting too often out of position, then ending up on the turn with too high of a range, checking, and then exposing themselves to in position just stabbing and scooping, scooping too many pots. From there, I have explored more into the texture stuff, and I've realized that there's a ton of hotspots where in position just folds too much to check raise. This happens both when we're EP, MP cutoff raiser, and much more so when we're small blind raiser, because I think ranges are wider there. I wouldn't say much more so, but I notice more spots that are sort of hot for check raise bluffing. So my reason behind it has sort of been more exploitatively geared. Like, yeah, I'm checking for the simplification, but now I'm also checking because I think it's actually possibly one of the most maximally exploitative things I can do if I'm check raising efficiently on the boards that I should. Question in the chat: is it really incentivized if villains are not stabbing enough? No, but it's assumptive to think that villains aren't stabbing enough, because if you do mass database research, what you'll realize is that environmental stabbing frequencies across the board are actually more aggressive than solvers. And so I think I mentioned this back in October too, when I was talking about small blind versus big blind. I was sort of clarifying something that's the main skepticism of the check range strategy on the small blind. Something that like the theory oriented guys will come in and argue is that, I'll give you the main argument. It was that, why would we ever check range on the flop when the solver uses a small 1/3 sizing, big blind is overfolding? These guys thought that that meant that the solver was showing us a natural exploit strategy for small blind. That small blind was actually exploiting big blind by betting 1/3 and forcing him to fold too much, because big blind was folding significantly above the 1 minus A. And what I said was, the first problem is you're looking at 1 minus A as if it actually parlays itself into correct theoretical analysis once you introduce continuous ranges. That's something that like is rigid toy game theory. It's not something that applies once you get into solver territory. What solver's actually doing is finding an equilibrium by facing off two maximally exploitative strategies against each other until it rests at that equilibrium. The first thing you'll realize with the 1/3 bets that it's using as bluffs is that they're also mixed strategies, which means that they must have the same EV to start by checking. So the main argument that these guys was using immediately falls apart once you realize that this is not an exploit. They were saying, why would I ever not bet 1/3 when I could seize that opportunity on the flop? My argument is that you're going to get that opportunity on future streets, otherwise this hand wouldn't be a mixed strategy bluff to begin with. So how would we be exploited if we checked range? We would be exploited if people checked back way too often. For instance, like, I think if you run an ace high flop, and it definitely depends what ace high flop, but if you run an ace high flop in solver, small blind versus big blind, and you lock out a position for check range, big blind might bet something like 15 to 20% of the time. That's not happening in practice. People aren't that well studied, and they're not clairvoyant to the fact that you're checking range. So the standard c-bet on an ace high board is something like 35%, which I think is around what the solver bets if you were to use an optimal c-bet frequency. Meaning big blind would bet something like 35% if small blind would go out of his way to bet an optimal c-bet frequency. Something near that at least. So the argument can be said that our value hands are no longer losing out if the villain doesn't take the maximal exploitative strategy and if he keeps stabbing at a high rate. On top of that, I still get all my check raise exploits in because he's actually stabbing too often, especially on other textures. I haven't checked this for all pools, but in most pools, the stabbing frequency is above what the solver suggested frequency is for stabs in position versus an out of position pre-flop raiser. And that's happening because people are betting too many top pairs, probably stabbing a little bit too often with bluffs. They're merge betting too much, and they're not checking back enough sets. Not that solver checks back many sets, but this stuff kind of adds up as you get to the turn in the river. Like, the more you cap yourself from the flop, the more unprotected your range is left on future streets. So that's sort of my rant. Is like, it's a good point that it wouldn't be incentivized if the villains were not stabbing enough, but they actually are, so it's a moot point. Still there, Tim? Sorry, bro. How many hands do you want to bet we'll get through in the session? I'll take the under on 10. I said, how many hands do you want to bet that we'll get through in this session? I'll take the under on 10.
I don't get that.
Because you don't speak English?
Yeah.
The under, like, how do I say this to a foreigner? By the way, Tim and I troll each other like a ton. It's probably the first person that I've met where I only known him for a week and we make more gay jokes at each other than like it's really bad. The under, um like if I say I'll take the under on 10, it means that that I think that we're a favorite to not get through 10 hands. That's what it is.
In 90 minutes,
Yeah,
I think more because some of them will be standard that you'll just skip it.
that's true. So this hand I thought was a fold. And it's I thought a really good hand because it's a really good hand because it's the type of hand that a theory-oriented player wouldn't see. Somebody in the chat said, "How many dicks would Tim sock at a gay party?" I'll take the over on 3. I don't know if we looked at. I know we didn't look at any of these in the first lesson, but you and I might have looked at them separately. This hand I think is standard to the turn. Well, this is kind of fun. So, what's your thoughts on the river? And what type of thought process is at the forefront of your mind for analyzing whether or not you feel like you need to be protecting your check call range here? In other words, like defending at sort of like a theory optimal frequency.
So the turn went check check here.
Yeah.
No, check check call. Right.
Yeah, check check. No, no, yeah, check call. You're right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I would like think about how many straights he can have here. Uh, Apex.
One of the things I've been telling guys to look at lately is how protected is your range. It's kind of like a combination of how much can he rep and how protected is your range. Where I think the second one is actually the one that matters more. Because if you think about like the extreme example of it, if your range was like super nutted in this spot, no one's interested in bluffing you. Agreed?
Yeah.
That's like the first thing that people look at before they even decide whether or not they're going to bluff is like how protected is my opponent by the nuts. So if your range is super strong and super protected by the nuts, he's not interested. As you go on the gradient down toward the other end of the spectrum, guys tend to pressure those ranges more, and it makes sense. Like in the same reason, in the same way that the Bayesian concept that I mentioned makes sense from before, this makes sense that it's harder to defend a capped range than a really protected range. So again, this is one of the main ways that you see aggressive thinking players running over passive regs or just fish in general is that they'll use overbets versus capped ranges to generate disproportionate amounts of fold equity. So one of the things that you should start to become more aware of versus the thinking players at your limit is what is their perception of your range. I've mentioned that I did this at 1020 when I started to have a lot of success there in early 2016. I had been using the overbet sequence, like just the overbet exploits in the river with too many bluffs because it created a disproportionate amount of fold equity. Then you get to 1020 and you meet 5 other guys, 10 other guys that all were hip to the same thing and they were doing that too. And they think it's going to continue to work at 1020, except the oversight is that now they're up against all their friends who know about that little trick. So the dynamic sort of changed, and I realized very quickly that the way to exploit 1020 was actually to call overbets light because people were targeting them at capped ranges. So I would intentionally cap myself and then call super light. And I made a lot of money like that in the first few months of 2016 just by sort of flipping the paradigm. So, like, there's nothing that's permanently sustainable, but if you are flexible in how you understand the paradigm that the opponent's in, you can kind of do a lot. So, this type of thing that I'm mentioning here is like, how to prepare yourself for the vacuum paradigm of your pool. A guy who you don't have history with is going to be less likely to bluff you when your range is super protected and more likely to bluff you when your range is capped, because that's the general stasis of the community. People are in forums. People understand that on Run It Once, it's cool to pressure capped ranges. There's nothing wrong with that. It makes sense, but it's kind of level one. And once you get up against a thinking player, you have to be careful how rigidly you apply that, because the thinking player sees the forums too, and he understands the paradigm that you're in. So a lot of stuff I mention that works on level one won't work on level two. Your job is to figure out what level your villains are on, and that's why I advocate going into an environment with a general blueprint strategy. You're there to exploit the worst 60% of players at the limit, and to sort of pay attention to the top 40% of players at the limit, so you can sort of compartmentalize them and figure out how you're going to make separate maximally exploitative strategies for them, or how to note take really well on them so you can stay up on how they're trying to exploit your baseline blueprint or just the general history that you have with them. So back to this hand, since we're not all that protected, I'm a little bit more interested off the jump in protecting this range. Now let's look in terms of like how many bluffs he could potentially have in his range. Was he button versus big blind? So this is my first data point, is that button versus big blind is going to have generally a wider range than cutoff versus big blind or middle position versus big blind. So it's a data point that is subtle, but I'm using it and hoping that it snowballs into something else. Texture. He floats flop on a board that I know gets overfolded because basically everybody folds too many flops versus small bet sizing. So I expect this player will have not enough ace 10, not enough backdoor flush draw spade draw, backdoor flush draw club, or front door spade draw, not enough ace 8 suited. Like that type of stuff I think will get floated. Stuff like queen 6 club definitely gets floated from the flop. All of his gutters I think he'd probably float if he knows what he's doing. So I'm kind of looking for ways that his in practice floating range might connect more with this turn than a solver would. Generally, when someone's overfolding, it's going to make it harder for them to be bluffing as aggressively on the turn as a solver would. I think this card gives him a decent amount of connectivity. It's going to give him open-ended straight draws with all of his 8x that floated the flop, and that's not good heading to the river because it turned into a straight. So immediately we can start creating a profile to say like, okay, if this guy is going to be a profile that's really worth calling against, he's got to be the type of guy that floats stuff like ace jack, queen jack, jack 10. I'll start with those hands because I think they make up the bulk of like what this profile would need to do. Then he's got to turn them into two street bluffs in the turn in the river. And the weird thing is, or I guess the interesting thing is, I do think this is a river where a lot of players might pull more triggers than average because they would perceive your range as not so protected by an 8x, and they would perceive their range as more protected by 8x or more able to represent 8x. So just in the standard vacuum paradigm of how I expect guys to attack you in the spot, I think it's an average to above average spot where you could expect them to pull more triggers than on other textures. Like if a guy gets here with queen jack jack 10 ace jack, I think he's more likely to pull a trigger on a 4 than on a deuce of diamonds. Because I think it just stands out to him as a spot where it might put more pressure on your capped range, and it also is going to be perceived to him as a card that's more in his range than yours. So that's my first thing, kind of making me want to bluff catch at least at a decent frequency. But in order to do that, I have to support that he's floating those hands to begin with on the flop, and that he's starting up a 2-street aggression line on the turn. He could have stuff like deuces and threes that could play similarly. Threes actually made a straight, so that's not good. Generally, I see guys that like float the deuces, ace jack, ace queen on the flop. They check back too often on the turn in these spots, and they play for free showdown. And by too often, I mean I think solver's betting them at some frequency, and I think the pool just ends up not betting them often enough, period. So it's kind of hard for me to create a profile of a player who would have too many bluffs here unless I could say that he was betting frequently with those types of broadways that he floated like ace jack, ace 10, ace queen. So that's kind of like the main part of his range that I'm most interested in is like, unless I can say with high confidence that that part of his range is barreling aggressively, I don't think I can create an interval that looks good for calling here. So I think I would fold unless I was up against one of the more aggressive profiles in the limit. I keep thinking we're going to be able to see their hand. Oh, I guess we did because you called like a fish. Okay, so I thought you folded there. How annoying would it be if I just was like, told you so after every hand? Results. I think this is something that we saw in the first review where you have a tendency to try to barrel people off parts of their range that they might not be willing to get off of. Like the first thing I see here when a middle position player calls a cutoff open and then calls a flop c bet is that I would guess that his range is more protected by ace x than you seem to think it is. It's either that or you think that you actually have a substantial amount of fold equity on hands like ace 10 and ace jack through the river. Which part of that sounds true to you? Or more true?
The second one.
That you think you can make him fold ace 10 ace jack?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's about as simple as trying to train that out because I think it's highly assumptive and it's not going to fit. It just doesn't work, not in a vacuum. I think you would need really good reads to know that somebody was willing to fold that hand to you. And then even at that point, it's not really a sustainable exploit because the first time that they see that you show up with a bluff here, that's when they're going to start to expand their check call range. So I tend to avoid these like really intense exploits these days unless I'm in a total vacuum because like I would never recommend to a student that he tries to plow into a reg because the reg has some sort of like general tendency to check fold a river. I think that it's good if you reserve it and if you like refine it. But like if I tell you to go all out versus a reg who's got like 60% fold to river c bet, it's going to do you more harm than good if you over apply that because at some point we have to accept the fact that that reg is also a human being who's going to realize that he's getting run over and all he has to do is apply a counter strategy that's really easy to apply. You just got to start clicking call on the river with more top pair. So in my experience, that's not really a part of my game that I'm all that interested in because I don't think it's sustainable and I think it leaves you on the ass end of the information game too often. Like you're constantly playing that guessing game of like, well, when is he gonna realize? And usually it's when you show him that first bluff. But I don't think it's like something to put a ton of attention on, like to study all these spots. Like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be three barreling here like all day from now on, because you're not gonna be able to do that for too long before you get blown out of the water. So I think that should sort of exit, and then what you become more focused on is like how to refine the smaller exploit spots that people aren't as familiar with because they don't study the mass database analysis and they're not well versed on what textures are good for people to be exploitatively check raising on. So they're the ones that are consistently overfolding in spots where they don't even realize they're overfolding. That's more what my game looks like now. It's like doing really, really detailed database research to find like the hidden codes where people aren't even aware that they're exploitable. That's what I'm more interested in. And that looks like a lot of small ball stuff, like a lot of smaller pots where I'll be the guy that check raises instead of check folds, or I'll be the guy that check raises instead of plays the mixed strategy check call because I know that versus what the environment's doing, the check raise is actually substantially more incentivized. That has to do with like the queen 10, the first hand we looked at. So all that being said, like this is not a turn that I'm even really interested in balancing a bluffing range on in a vacuum. And I know that might sound crazy because you tell a theory guy that and he's like, Nick Howard's so bad, he's so exploitable, but I'll be the guy that beats the limit because I actually know what's going on in the environment. So I expect there to be like a big difference in the next year between how much respect the theory guy in the forums gets, because there will come a point, and like my purpose in poker right now is basically designed around cleansing the theory bias and helping all the theory guys come to their senses that the way that they're insisting that strategies need to look are not actually incentivized by environments. Funny enough, I think those guys are the most frustrating to deal with because they seem to have the most to prove. They don't want to let go of their paradigm because it's threatening that they could be wrong. And I think the main reason that happens is most of the theory oriented players that are that stubborn aren't having good results. So all of the asshole theory guys that come out and flame people in the forums are actually the really frustrated players that are really confused as to why they haven't put up good numbers in the last couple of years. You wanted to turn that into a bluff on the river, huh?
honestly.
The thing about the king here is like, first of all, I think you have a good deal of non-zero showdown to check back. So in the realm of you turning this hand into a bluff, I think it makes less sense. I get that you remove ace king. I like to see what a solver does. There's this one guy who always watches the streams, and then he'll send me like a solver report for a certain hand. So Mike, if you're out there watching this, run this one for us. He was the guy that told me that your pocket jacks in the last session with a club was a three barrel. You remember it? This is like a similar spot.
The Russian guy,
I don't know if he's Russian. I don't think he is.
the that I added on Skype.
Oh no, no, that's my friend that I made the PO unlocked pack alongside. Question in the chat. King Queen isn't one of the best three barrels in an optimal sense. Not practically. Yeah, I think that's true. But it's also sort of like in the back of my mind, just in terms of like the relevance of the other data points that I have available, which is just that I think that out of positions range is too well protected by ace-x, and I'm not interested in moving him off of it. G. Maiko says, won't bother with balancing a bluffing range, in quotes. What do you mean exactly? You will check all bluffs like 9-8 suited as well? Oh, good question. So I'll still bet the really robust bluffs because I think that they still make a lot of sense to bet and they don't need nearly as much fold equity to be deemed plus EV. And then you get into an argument there, well, what do I mean by plus EV? Plus EV relative to checking? Because now there's two different types of EVs we can look at. Checking is clearly going to have EV when you have 9-8 suited on the turn. So it gets a little bit foggy. But in general, I think that like it's totally fine to bet an open-ended straight draw or flush draw. Like if I was going to say general rule of poker, I think I said this to a student the other day, like I'll never eat your lunch for betting a flush draw. Like it's so rare that like I'll yell at someone for betting a flush draw in a spot where the player was just always calling, like pre-river, I mean, where he still has equity to peel. So yeah, it's a good thing to clear up. Is like when I say I won't balance a bluffing range, I just mean that like I won't be betting any sort of low equity bluff. I'll choose to be imbalanced towards too much value, and the bluffs that I do bet will be the ones that have like 8 outs or more. And I mean like robust outs, like to the nuts. Question in the chat: don't those guys who actually let pair of their paradigm actually change the environment from the top down though? I don't understand. Can you fix the one word? The pair? Oh, theory guys. Okay, you said don't let go. Don't those guys who don't let go of their paradigm actually change the environment from the top down? I think if you mean do they have do they make up enough of the pool to make the pool more or less very theory oriented? I would say yes. And that's one of the things that I go into um, like as my blueprint strategy. I go into the pool like these guys are the guys that post on the forums. Basically, these guys are the guys that read the forums. These guys are the guys that are theory oriented because that's where the general stasis of the community is. So a lot of my blueprint strategy is designed around how to exploit theory oriented players. I think something will come up later that I'll expand on that more. If you meant something different, just let me know. Or do you mean like how they affect the fish in the pool? What's the worst hand you bluff? Is 10-9 suited still robust? In this spot, no, I don't think it's robust enough. And I'm just gauging that on how protected I think his range actually is by ace high. So there's pre-flop data points that go into that too. Like the middle position raise first in is probably 20% or so. I think if you looked at the alias of the environment. Tim, I don't know about your pools, but most small stakes pools Also, the cutoff alias 3-bet range. Again, I don't know if this hand is, I guess this hand is vacuumed, so we should use it. The cutoff 3-bet across most small stakes environments is like between 3 and 4%. That incentivizes middle position to be folding too much versus 3-bet. So now he gets to the flop with an even tighter range. All of those things are more data driven than they are assumptive, so I'm going to use them knowing that there's still a degree of assumption behind them. It exists in a confidence interval that's better off. I'm better off using it than not using it. Okay, cool. I like not having a a delay so people can respond to me right
So
away.
much because you wanna win the bet.
Oh, the 10 and under bet? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. We should have actually made a bet, but I guess I would just be biased. So this is something I think you would not be doing like even the day after that lesson,
Well done.
like forcing this type of shit. I think it's something that you've been focusing on churning out a lot more.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the data. It's strange.
Oh yeah, that's something that he said yesterday was that he's been like much more comfortable making shifts from seeing the black and white data that like I show him that like this just isn't happening, you just thought it was happening. For me that was the biggest thing too, was like finally coming to terms with how much I was projecting onto the player pool. And it's pretty fucking humbling actually, because it shows you that you were like really biased, like really wrong. Well, you can't bluff raise here, so what are you gonna do? Let's start with the two-step analysis. Like I said last time, how protected do you think your range is in this spot?
It is protected by some flushes. Um, Probably with some sets.
Yeah, I would say that you can have sets here that didn't raise the turn because the flush came in.
Yeah, and
Do you expect him to see that? Like, is that a hard thing to see? This is like one of the questions I ask. Like, how hard is, how likely is my opponent to be perceiving the same thing I see? And when I ask myself that, I'm aware of how deep I'm looking into the texture. Like, there's a lot of things I see that I know people don't see because they're things that I've really dug deep for. But like, this is not a hard thing to see. I don't think that you could have some flushes and that your sets would have been hesitant to check raise turn once the flush came in. I'm basing that just off of like, this is a good point, but it's worth bringing up. You guys should start reading forums a lot just to sort of balance out your baseline perspective of how the fuck people in your environment think. Because it'll help you stop projecting bias onto what people are thinking versus you in hand. I remember there was a time where I really soaked up a lot of forum stuff and I was like, wow, people are thinking about the game like way different than I would have thought had I not read this stuff. And whether or not they're being stupid or not, what's important is that you understand them. Like you understand why they're saying what they're saying and how they see the game. Um, there was this thing that Galfon said like years back that I remember and still sticks with me because I think I believe it much more now. But like he was like doing a interview for some magazine or something, I forget, and he said they asked him a question like, "How do you win?" or something like stupidly basic, and he was like, "I just feel like once I understand how the other guy thinks about the game, I beat him." That's basically what you want, is you want to understand what the blueprint paradigm of your pool is, and that can be separated between fish and knit regs and the more aggro regs. Like I said about the thing about the Bovada 10-20 games where I started flipping the script on the thinking aggro regs and then calling versus their overbets light, that type of stuff. That's really what defines you as a high level thinker, is how flexibly you can understand what paradigm a certain portion of the interval of the alias resides in. So here we have two reads that are pretty high confidence because they're not that hard to find, even for a low level thinking player. You can be protected by flushes, and you now have nutted hands at a way higher rate than on other rivers that didn't pair. To me, that might be one of the reasons that I think he's overbetting, and I think he's probably going to be polarized to a boat in this spot because of the fact that you have a substantial amount of boats, I really doubt he's going to even double overbet the nut flush, especially since it has a lot of blockers. That could be me projecting on him in a certain to a certain extent, but he's betting like he's betting almost 3x. Like he's betting like 2.7 or something. 2.5. So I'm generally uninterested in bluff catching here to begin with, and if I did want to bluff catch, I think I would need like the ace of diamonds because it would. But here's the weird thing: if we take him off nut flushes that value bet, we actually don't want to block the ace of diamonds because it could be his most utilized bluffing hand. So I think I take that back and I say I wouldn't want to block the ace because I don't think it blocks many of his value hands. I don't think many guys 2.7x here with nut flush on a paired board where you're protected by boats. I think it's more geared towards boats. So if I did bluff catch, I think I'd want a hand like you have. That being said, I still don't think it's that close. I don't think that he's well balanced enough with um, with value in a 2.7x overbet line.
So would you ever like? I mean, what do you prefer to have here, like flush or I don't know,
I would
like
fold. I would fold the flush because now if we're saying with high confidence that he's either got a nut flush or a boat, then I'm not calling with any flush because it's the same relative value with even worse blockers as a 9-10. I think you could say it's worse blockers, even though you would block some nut flushes. Um, so yeah, I'm only calling with boats. And then the question almost becomes, well, what boats? And that depends on how much nut flush he's actually able to show up with here. So I think it would be too assumptive to maybe fold pocket fives in the off chance that he can have a small amount of bluffs and some nut flush. It would be far too assumptive to fold pocket eights because now we dominate pocket fives, which is like a really, really big chunk of his value betting range, especially when we block pocket eights. Question in the chat: are we mixing sets in this spot, or do you call all sets on the flop? I would guess that you check raise some sets on the flop, but if you do get to the turn, you definitely check call. So yeah, I would say that sets are discounted from the flop, but when they get to the turn, would you say you ever check raise?
with set?
Yeah.
On this particular flop, probably not, because I know that I'm gonna do a lot of checking
I mean on the turn
on a turn with a flush.
with a set.
Yeah, and the flush card came.
So you would never check raise, or you would check raise?
No.
Ah, okay. So I think that's like pretty standard. I don't think there's many players who would make that mistake because I think it's actually a mistake. Guy in the chat says that's a shove coming from 5-5 and 8-8. Yeah, I tend to agree. Wow, you called, you fish. At least you're getting better, Tim. Cool. The other thing that I would mention, and this is a little bit more abstract, but I think that if you get it from a psychological level, it actually means a lot. This guy has $83 behind. If he was bluffing and he wanted to overbet bluff, he has a lot of different options for how much he can overbet. He's picking the most expensive one, and it's massively expensive. It's like 2.5x pot. Psychologically, if you had the option to overbet and you thought that the overbet as a generic thing, like overbetting gets more folds, if that's the paradigm that you're in, you have a lot of different ways to convince yourself that you could have used a smaller sizing than 83.7, 250, 270% of the pot for you to balance with your bluffs or for you to use exploitatively with your bluffs. So when a guy's actually using, when he's pushing it to the limit, when he's betting all of it, it's, I think you could almost say it's a Bayesian application of the fact that he seems uninterested in giving himself any type of discount when really to get the point across on the overbet, he really didn't need to bet 270% pot. He could have bet 150% pot. He could have even bet 200% pot, and you would have been just as hands tied. Like you would have been just as pressured. So when I say it, you could get the point across for cheaper. I'm saying that like these sizings that are more like 200 300% pot, I think are hugely disproportionately weighted toward value. And I don't mean like I know that you should have a lot of value when you bet that sizing, but I mean they have much more value than they should and not enough bluffs to be well balanced.
Okay.
So I would actually say I agree with Mako in the chat that the bet sizing data point here is actually the most valuable one you have, and then the second most valuable data point is that it's not that hard for the villain to be in a paradigm where he sees that your range is well protected by nutted hands on this river. Those two I think are like really telling, and I wouldn't even look at anything else. I don't think so. Like when you get good at this stuff, oscillating through data points, what you're basically doing is like over the course of time, you get better at tagging something and putting it up in the top right quarter of your mind, ready to come back to it and combine it all. And then what you get good at on top of that is training yourself to look for the most relevant ones first. So if I see something that stands out to me, like why is villain using a 2.7 sizing in a spot where my range is protected by the nuts, those two immediately merge into me knowing it's a fold because that's just what that translates into in my context. It's integrated to the point where I know that those two data points don't match up to any sort of optimal bluffing frequency, and it's just snap fold, very uninterested in even thinking about it any further. But that's what you want because it's the most advanced form of analysis distilled into the least amount of mental energy. And when you have something like that, it prevents tilt because you don't end up going into some direction that starts to rationalize like, oh, but he could have a lot of ace diamond hands in his range, or what if he has the nut flush? Like you're already sort of past that. You're sort of like flying above that level of rationalization because you've clarified over a lot of repetition that it's just not worth going into. There's more relevant stuff to base a decision off of. Excuse me. Five hands, Tim. Here's an easy one for you. You win. Somebody said in the chat that that's helped him a lot. That to see that your range is protected allows you to understand why someone wouldn't be exploitatively bluffing you in that spot, especially for like a huge sizing. I think that's a huge point. A lot of guys don't put enough attention on how they're perceived because they haven't been trained to, and so you see the thought process contracting into them trying to range the opponent when there's definitely like just better data points available to base the decision on. What was the line? Call flop
Yeah, and I bet
thoughts? I know what you're gonna do.
yeah, I just thought that he would barrel here with anything good because now ace x has the gut shot, and I thought just he has under pairs.
Wait, what? You bet turn.
Yeah, and I said that I think that if he would have something, I don't know, like a queen or something, that he would barrel here.
Okay. So you think he's capped, is what you mean?
I don't think I could say capped, but not so strong.
So more capped than he should be
Yeah,
once he checks turn.
I say that.
Okay, I think I can get on board with that. One thing that I know that's sort of reworked my assumption around that spot is that I've seen a lot of mass database analysis that says that once they check call turn, they don't check fold river too often. So that sort of reworked my assumption to say that, okay, something's going on where even though these guys aren't well protected enough on the check call, somehow they still don't fold enough rivers. So then that data point becomes more relevant than using the one that he's capped. It's important to see how this works because the reason that we think it's valuable to identify that he's capped is because we're used to thinking that that's an indicator that he folds too much. Now introduce a mass database sample point that says that that's not actually going on in this specific line, and you can immediately overturn that assumption that him being capped in this line means he's overfolding. It doesn't. It's not an easy thing to see unless you have the numbers in front of you. So remind me tomorrow or something when we meet to show you this, because I have it for I think a few small stakes no limit environments over really large samples. And it's kind of tricky because you would think that it would get overfolded, but it just doesn't. So it's not something like I love this type of stuff because it's not something you could know unless you actually had the numbers to look at it. And then once you have them, it's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to argue with them? For me, that's what it took. Like for me, I needed something I couldn't argue with to stop being stubborn about it. So it's been, I think, the best thing that happened to my career. So based on that, when I get to spots like these and I bet the turn, I can't think of a spot where I've really been all that interested in firing three. I can't think of a hand history I've looked at with a student where like I really was excited about him firing another barrel because when the mass database analysis presses out to be somewhat equivalent to what the solver is doing, what that means is that on average, it's going to be harder to find a specific texture where there's a huge deviation. It's going to be even harder to find a pattern grouping of specific textures where there's a huge deviation. Where you find something out that like they're folding to check raises 15% too often on average, maybe it's something more like 10 to 15, like that's a pretty big indicator that you're going to find a lot of pattern groupings where you can increase the efficiency of that exploit. So I'm sure that there are spots where on certain turn to river runoffs from specific flop textures, we should be firing a third barrel. But the problem at this point becomes sample size. You can't filter for 3-bet pots that get to the river because you just don't have, like, I can't even do it with a 30 million hand database. So because I lack confidence in the assumption, I end up just sort of passing on it. Um, and we've talked about this a bunch where like when you don't have a high confidence barrel, those are the spots where we're just going to sort of pass because we can see that like the voice in the head that wants to keep arguing that we could be missing an opportunity is the biased voice that has been forcing the aggression all along without enough data points to justify it. So remember when I think we talked about this and I've been saying it recently, like you almost have to take it on faith with this forcing aggression thing that it's not working out for you. It's because you can't really prove it in the spots that you're doing it because we don't have the database analysis to do it. All you can prove is that something is fucked up with your mentality when you want to force aggression in spots that you don't actually have a high confidence that they're good. The only reason you have is because surrendering the pot initially feels painful because it's giving up the pot and losing, and because you have this inkling that you don't want to miss an opportunity to potentially exploit. So if you can get to the bottom of that little compulsive voice, you'll realize that it's not actually like an objective voice. It's not actually accurate to listen to that voice. And then you have the choice of whether or not you want to basically mute it and override it.
Yep.
Zaxer asks, what's the most efficient way to analyze hands in Poker Tracker? I would say it's this, but this is a combination of doing a lot of outside work so that you can actually apply things like texture, position, mass database line reads, um, like everything we're doing. Like at the point at which you have enough fluency in every aspect of the game to go in and start to find more and more data points in your hand history analysis, that's when hand history analysis is the most efficient thing for you. Up until that point, it's far more relevant that you study the grid work, just to get familiar with benchmark equilibriums, then study the mass database research so you get familiar with the hotspots of your environment, then formulate your blueprint exploit strategy for the pool that you're in, then come back and do hand histories and say, okay, now how does all this look when the rubber meets the road? I think that's the best way. You're welcome, bro. Do I use filters in Hold'em Manager? I would say the main way I use filters now is what I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, where like what I've been doing with Tim recently is I'll have him put a specific line down, and since the most leaks that I see in general are from people folding too much, like on the flop, for instance, I will force him to put a filter for check fold on, and then because I can see every single hole card that he folded with every single flop texture, I'll use my pattern recognition to go down the line really quick and be like, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. And he just follows it down with me. He marks all of them. And then at the end of it, he's got a marked page of every single poor fold that he made. And then he goes back and he can use that to integrate the spots where he needs to not fold in the future. To me, that's like really useful because it's like pattern recognition two different ways. It's like the coach is using his pattern recognition to save time in the marking process, and then the student's using his pattern recognition as he studies it to build new pattern recognition. And the whole thing is pattern recognition because it's taking place in a specific line. I think that makes it easier to study. If like all the hands that you're going down the row are like small blind versus big blind, where you folded small blind after checking, it's really helpful to build sort of a context around what is an acceptable fold in that line and what's not. Hey Nick, when you talk about mass database analysis, is it about what limit site? Does it matter? Can you apply it to a lot of different environments? In your opinion, um, it applies to most environments in the hottest spots that I talk about regularly in this stream. A lot of spots that you saw me use in the October stream too that I mentioned. I mentioned them because I think they're useful for you guys because they're the universal leaks. Um, there are leaks that extend from small stakes all the way up to high stakes. Um, and then there's leaks that are more prone to small stakes environments. Like you'll see the intensity of pre-flop passivity get worse as you trend downward through the stakes. That's usually a trend. That being said, they exist through all stakes that I've studied for, like even 500 Zoom. I haven't gone so high as like 1K Poker Stars because I just think it's like somewhat irrelevant from a training perspective and from a perspective that it doesn't run and that I would never play those games because there's games that are just far more lucrative. But yeah, when I advise, one of the reasons I did the 200 Zoom October stream on PokerStars 200 Zoom was because I thought it would hit a wide demographic that it would be really helpful for because I was playing small stakes, applying universal small stakes exploits to a field that it was actually relevant in. And I think most of you guys are struggling with either small stakes or mid stakes, so I wanted to sort of gear it toward that for the sake of relevance. Um, there are definitely anomalies in different small stakes environments, but if I had to create a blueprint and give a level of confidence that it would work for all small stakes environments, I would put that at like an 8 out of 10. That I could give you a blueprint with a lot of different hotspots that you could start applying right away that would be applicable to basically universal small stakes pools. So when I mention the ones without specifying what environment it is, they're the ones that are universal. And if you can't tell, there's a lot of them because I say that shit a lot. Stuff like how often people defend versus one third. That's a universal leak, and it doesn't even matter what stakes it is. People don't defend versus one third enough. And I mean that like wherever you apply it, whether it's single raise pot or three bet pot. Skype group link isn't working for me. Can you check that out, Brian, when you get a chance? By the way, I'm going to reorganize the entire Skype group page. Tim actually had a good idea where he said, why wouldn't we do it where we categorize what you're looking for in terms of if you're a cash game player, a heads up player, an MTT player, or if you're strictly just looking to do like PO work. So I think I'm going to start to organize it that way with links, and I'll move everybody over when it's up. You're welcome. Okay. So here, it's just because of the mass database analysis saying that I know they don't fold enough across the PO suggested subset, I'm uninterested in trying to use my intuition or like whatever skills I have because I know they're not refined enough. I think that's where the humility kicks in. It's like I don't know enough about this runoff on this texture to argue that this is a spot where I'm going to get too many folds. Actually, if I was going to use my gut, I would say this is a spot where he's going to call too much because the way his range is comprised, I think he's just going to find too many hero calls with like nines, tens, any queen X. Because it's a total brick river. You have a lot of your bluffs intact, spades missed. And yeah, it's a level 1 context, but it also makes sense from a Bayesian application of it that it's easier for you to find too many bluffs when the flush draw misses than when there's a spade river. Skype group is totally free. I'm keeping it free. You just have to make an account with the site. and like sign up with your email, and then you'll be able to receive messages through the site. Another thing to talk about really quick right here is that like this theory oriented mindset that I say is like inundating the small stakes world, even like the mid stakes world, I would say. You know what? Just like the entire community, I think is still defaulting toward theory orientation, which is like when you have a mixed strategy hand that you know should be called at a significant frequency, there is this weird paranoia that kicks in as the time bank ticks down that generally has guys defaulting toward calling those types of hands. So if you think about a hand like jacks, tens, nines in this spot, they're probably mixed strategy hands at a high frequency. What tends to happen is that, and I just got out of a lesson with a student who has this leak, and I see it actually more often than ever before. What will happen is you will start, as your time bank gets down to 15, 10 seconds, the mind has this weird way of contracting onto a specific hand in villain's range that you could beat, or a specific tier of his range. So here it would be, if my time bank was ticking down as out of position and I was a theory oriented player, I would be looking at a mixed strategy hand like pocket tens, and then suddenly around 10 seconds left in my bank while I'm tanking, my mind goes into the direction of, okay, but he could have missed spades. He could have missed spades. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that here. I'm just saying that this tends to be something gets blown out of proportion, where even if the guy can find one or two combinations that he dominates, he's already convincing himself that it's more of a call because that's where his mind's attention is. And when it's through that tunnel, there's an unconscious bias that develops that distorts the frequency that the villain actually has that hand in its range. So it's one of the major mental game leaks that I think guys suffer from, and it comes from having a lack of discipline or just not having a stable enough, um, I guess you would say presence, but I don't want it to sound like new age and tacky like that. But like if you're not rooted steadily in a disciplined mindset, a lot of that comes from training to see only what's maximally relevant. Then you're prone to engaging all of these little like thought process distortions that basically twist your understanding of reality. Question: would you say that one of the biggest leaks on micros is overfolding on the big blind? Yeah, not three betting enough too. Any questions here, Tim, as to why we're not doing this anymore?
like shoving.
Yeah, like forcing aggression in a spot where we don't have the data confidence.
No,
I think you've kind of like already come a long way with this so far. In your recent hand histories, I haven't seen a lot of it at all. I see you doing more weird stuff now, like reshipping on guys that raise when they have like a range of set plus, but somehow you're getting away with it.
yeah, I did it today like 2 times and I didn't get away with it as well.
I think if they keep folding in those spots, what it means is that they're the type of reg that understands that the environment doesn't re-raise in those spots. So you're exploiting the exact reg, which is good. I would just caution against it because as soon as you get looked up there once or noted that you're the type of guy that does it, like here's all I'd say: if you're gonna do that shit, you have to be very aware of the times you get looked up. Because if you're not, then you're basically firing in the dark at regs that have you noted up, and that's where I got stomped in the past by being arrogant enough to think that I could just sustain those exploits versus guys that were actually smart enough to take notes on me, and then I just became like the raging aggro fish, and I didn't want to believe it because I was like, no, these guys have shown they fold in these spots, but they don't fold versus you anymore because they're actual real people that have seen a history with you. They're not robots. Okay.
You just really want to win this bet.
I don't think I'm gonna get to 10, so you can relax, especially after this hand. I guess I should tell the guys that are submitting that they don't need 20,000 hands. I think it'd be better if the guys who want to submit, and I'll mention it now in case I forget, I'm creating a schedule for November and some of the guys I've messaged out haven't even responded to me yet, and they're the ones that were first on the wait list. So there's a good chance that if you still want to apply for being on the show, you can get a slot for November like pretty easily. If not, I think I can for sure get you in for December, assuming there's not like a huge wave of you that email me right after this. But what I might do is switch it from asking for 20,000 hands to just telling you to something like 10, maybe like 20 that are very relevant for you, and maybe even have you like I think this might even be better is if I have you guys like write up a sentence or two about what your thought process was in the hand or what question you would like answered, and then you don't even need to come on the stream. No offense, Tim, but like you don't really need to be here, especially when they can't hear you that well. I mean, we love you, but
I can offer a good deal to cheese burgers. Thanks.
so like in the future, maybe it's just better if you prepare your questions and then you can show up in the chat and in ask any questions in the chat that you have about my analysis. One of the guys in the chat is saying I haven't sent my hands in yet. I would prefer to do it this way. Are you talking about the way that I'm outlining, or like to come on Skype with me? Honestly, I don't care. I'm just trying to do like what's more practical. Let me guess, you're bluff raising again, Tim.
No,
What was this line? Okay. I don't really mind this one as much because I think that the 8 actually connects pretty decently with your range. Um, the problem is he just doesn't have enough behind. Like that's the oversight is that like I really don't think you're going to get a guy off ace king and ace queen often enough when he's got 41 behind, especially if he's a recreational player. So I think this is ambitious because even though he's capped and even though you might be able to represent stuff on this texture, it requires that he's a very disciplined player to find this fold, and I don't know that I'm willing to attribute that confidence. Sorry, I thought he was anonymous, but okay, so we can go about two ways. What's your reads on him?
I don't remember.
Okay, so he's anonymous, we'll say.
Yeah.
I don't trust someone who plays 100 NL on micro to be stable. The reason, no offense to anybody who's playing small stakes, but the reason you guys are not playing higher is because you're not disciplined enough to make folds like this consistently. So when I go in as my blueprint strategy, I'm not trying to move someone off ace king in this spot because I know that the main reason they're stuck at small stakes to begin with is that they probably don't make folds like this consistently. So you can't exploit the player pool unless you know where they actually are exploitable. And I think what you're trying to do is push spots where they're not actually exploitable. And it's not your fault, like in the sense that like I get why you're doing it. I get that you think this card is allowing you to rep more and that you think that he should be able to get off one pair if he doesn't think that you bluff enough, but he's not operating from that paradigm. And I think that's what you're overlooking like consistently with like Tim before he met me seemed to think that people were much more capable of folding than they actually are because Tim operated in a paradigm where he projects on other players that they should be able to get off one pair when I'm clearly repping two pair. Except he doesn't think like you. And that's the arrogance. He's not from that paradigm. He's from the paradigm that says, well, I have $40 left behind in a large pot with top pair, top kicker. I'm just going to call. And a lot of these fuckers might be even thinking like, okay, bro, show me the two pair. Like that's a mentality that people use. They're fish, but it's like a tilt mentality. Like go to a live casino or watch a 200 NL player talk out loud, and he'll get at the point at which he's triggered, he'll start making plays like, all right, bro, just fucking show me then. Show me that you sucked me out again, and he'll call for that reason. Like that's the stuff that goes on. So I'm protecting myself against that by not doing stuff like this. And I can tell you this with high confidence because I've been through this type of transition as a player. I used to do all this type of shit. And then I had to come to the realization that like the reason it doesn't work is that people are not thinking about the game in the same way that I am. People are not ready to give me credit for it, and even if they are, they're not disciplined enough to fold top pair, top kicker. God, I'm so glad he showed you ace king there. It makes me look so good. Hey Brian, I know I was just talking about you. That's the type of student that he is. Um, I forget what I even said now, but I was thinking about you when I said it. This hand's fine. Looks like you're gonna win because we're at 10. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Brian would have this thing where like I would I would ask him why he called, and he would say shit like okay fucker, show me this time how you did it. It's like strictly self sabotage mode. This one seems okay. Oh yeah, cause no, it kind of sucks. I think you're priced in, but I don't think I'm gonna skip this one because I don't know, and I think I'd have to run some sims as to whether or not this is a jam or a call. One thing I can say is if he's gonna fold tens behind, this is a way better jam. I think like almost immediately. The more he calls and doesn't five bet, the better your call is. But I'm gonna kind of just leave it alone. Here's a cool one. So the most important thing that stands out to me here, before I ask myself how protected my range is, there's a data point that trumps that in relevance, and it's can you dominate a portion of his value range? So start with that one first, and then attribute a degree of confidence to the fact that he could potentially have dominated value hands. So let's start by saying, can he have ace queen?
Yeah.
Very standard and very correct for him to have ace queen. So we definitely have some sort of split equity. Let's leave that alone. Can he have ace jack?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's probably part of an optimal strategy, depending on what pre-flop range we give cutoff. Especially on a board like this, I think you could be more likely to bet the ace jack on the river because it's just more like dry. Um, so we're gonna assign like a medium amount of confidence that he could show up with a very non-zero amount of ace jack, considering it fits a standard three bet strategy and also we're saying it fits a bet 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 strategy. So when those two things are in place right away, that I think I have split equity and a substantial amount of domination, I'm already finding it hard to believe that I have a fold. The things that would overturn that, or as if I could say he has like a very, very low bluffing frequency, like something between 0 and 5%, then now that might be enough to overturn the fact that I have domination. So how high is your confidence that he's never bluffing here? And to get that data point, to balance that in a way that's less assumptive, let's try to visualize how protected your range is in this spot.
I think it's pretty protected by ace
I think it's decently protected by ace x. Then again, if we were looking from a player like your eyes, you would be trying to get him off ace x. So I think you're kind of like an anomaly in that sense that like you think you can get guys off hands that they're actually well protected by. But I think like the general trend of the pool is to see the villain is now protected by ace x at a decent frequency. I'm not all that interested in bluffing. That being said, I do still think there's guys that can pull triggers here from a theory oriented perspective and just be like, okay, well, I have to bluff stuff sometimes, so I'm going to choose this hand to bluff. So I'm not ready to say that he never has a bluffing frequency because this doesn't stand out to as a spot to me where like you have a lot of nutted hands. It just stands out as a spot to me where like you're decently protected by top pair, and I think it wouldn't surprise me if guys chose to barrel some percentage of their Broadway bluffs here on the river or something like that. So now my data points are I can say with relatively high confidence that I should expect him to have a substantial amount of dominated hands, like a very non-zero amount of dominated hands or split equity. So that's basically what it's merging into is like I expect to have equity coming from hands in his value range that I either tie or beat. And then the second part of it is how much do I think he's actually bluffing in this spot? So based on what your confidence is that he's never bluffing, if you could say he's never bluffing, I could probably still find the fold because I don't think he has enough ace jack to make us indifferent to just call to beat his ace jack. You can see how you're getting far away from like theoretical modeling at this point. But I actually think it's a smarter way of looking at it because you're actually oscillating through different player profiles and trying to attribute frequencies that shit is actually going on specific textures in order to get a more accurate answer. So the important part is we remain honest about how much confidence we have in each specific data zone. I'm pretty confident that people can bet ace jack here, at least at some non-zero percentage. I don't know how much, but I'm really confident they bet ace queen. So I've definitely got some split equity. I've got a little bit of domination, and I'm not really clear on how much he bluffs, but I definitely think people have some sort of bluffing frequency here. So when I add all those up, again, this isn't science. It's just me getting a feel for where I'm sort of at with the intervals. And in this type of spot, based on the data points, I'm dominating some value. I have some split equity, and I can't say with super high confidence that he's never bluffing. I can say with decent confidence that he's not bluffing enough, but I can't say with enough confidence that he doesn't bluff enough because of the fact that I have domination on top of it to justify a fold. So, for instance, he could be bluffing 15% of the time, and with my domination, I can still justify a call with my split equity plus domination. So it's kind of an interesting hand in the sense that like one of the first examples, especially today, where we've merged a dominated portion of his value range with a potential for him to be under bluffing and still been able to find a call. So in order to fold here, what type of confidence would you have to have on his range? Give me two data points, one from his value and one from his bluffs.
I like that he doesn't kill up, doesn't bluff on the river, and maybe like that he's three betting really tight pre-flop.
Yeah, or that he just doesn't value bet thin and wouldn't have ace jack.
Yeah,
Cool. I do think that there's a profile that you could make that fold against, but it would be the nittiest 10% of players in your environment. That's why I'm not just like breezing over that hand. Hmm. So first, I'd like to hear your thought process on why you think raising is superior to flatting, because obviously we're not folding.
well,
This is a
he,
three bet pot that went check check flop.
yeah, I think this one's the fish. Um, and I thought that if he has like an ace, ace jack, ace queen, he's gonna call either way, and like it's the same like thought process that I used before I want to raise here for river not to mess up my action or not to hurt my hand.
So you don't want to lose your market on weaker hands in a
Yeah,
spot where you expect there could be a lot of complicating type rivers,
yeah, and that he's gonna call either way.
and that he will call right now with ace jack through ace king, maybe even any ace.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so the most important part of figuring out if you have incentive to follow up on that analysis is how often you'll actually lose your market if you choose to call, and how many hands he actually has as poorly randomized bluffs that could potentially blast off. I think the biggest thing you have going for you here is that there's a player who checked the flop and now bets on an ace. I don't necessarily think from a linear small blind 3 bet, if that's what he's actually playing, which is what most players do, even if he's a fish, this is kind of a hard board for him to not have a piece of as small blind versus middle position 3 bet. Agreed? Unless you have a stat on him that he's a raging psycho 3 better fish, that he'll have hands like king 4 suited in this spot. I think it's not all that easy for him to be naked here. And then you have to also add in, and this is more advanced, but like if someone actually is an aggro profile maniac fish, they're much more prone to just start by leading their bluffs on the flop. He didn't do that. He checked. So he either has some sort of slow play, some sort of marginal showdown, or he paired the ace at a very high rate. And I have high confidence in those three things, like one of those three things being what's happening, because I trust the read that the agromaniac fish actually starts by barreling a lot of his air on the flop. Um, so in order to override that, in order to make an override and say that calling is better, one of the main things we would need is an argument that he could potentially be blasting off with poorly randomized bluffs, low equity bluffs, if we allowed him to hang himself and kept his range wider by calling. In a spot like this, I don't think that's actually happening. So I think you're actually right for just taking the value you have right now by jamming. And then sometimes you'll make him fold a 9-8 suited or push him to near indifference with 9-8 suited, and that's all good because that hand was well randomized. Um, so yeah, I actually like this one a lot more. There was a couple we looked at in Prague when you were there where like you were making mistakes polarizing in spots where I didn't think you were polarized enough. And then there was like a couple of spots recently where I thought that with a low stacked pot ratio, you didn't give him enough of a chance to make a mistake with bluffs in his range. This situation's unique because I don't actually think he has a lot of naked bluffs in his range. And you could very well lose your market if you decide to flat. And river comes jack, 8, 10, club, queen. So I agree with this one. All right, cool. I think that's going to sum it up for this one. I'm going for about 90 minutes. I think this is a good length for student lesson review. I made a post in the Run At Once forums yesterday. I'm going to try this new format out. It's going to be what I'm calling like a forum crawl. It's going to be my way of sort of like giving back to the Run At Once forums. Instead of typing all my answers, I'm literally going to go through and read through like high stakes, mid stakes, and small stakes NL posts, and I'm going to teach you guys like how to ask better questions, and also if you want to give responses, how to give a response that's actually worth something. Um, a response of least assumption or a response of um, intelligent direction. And I wanted to tell you guys if you want to, like, for instance, if I'm doing this on Wednesday, if on Tuesday night or Wednesday you want to post in the forums, I'll like get to that post because it'll be toward the top. So like anybody who's active in the chat on like Tuesday night, if you want some hands looked at, or if you just want to start like a thread with a certain topic that you want to generate discussion on, go ahead and post it in like we'll say middle stakes NL. Maybe that'll just be like the hotspot for where my stream posts. Like either high stakes or middle stakes NL. Small stakes tends to get spammed quite a bit, so I think maybe I won't do as much there unless we're like freed up on time. Um, but yeah, you can just start to generate topics there, and I'll get to them in the stream, and hopefully we'll prioritize our guys first as usual. But I think it'll be a really healthy way of you guys starting to see like what I see when I look at the forums because I think I see it a lot differently than most people do, and where I direct my attention is more like where I think someone's available, like even available for an upgrade. And a lot of the questions I see asked, I don't sense that the player is even available to be told what the right answer is because he's asking the question in a way that reinforces the problem that he's dealing with. So it's going to be more work on like understanding what paradigms people are coming from, gaining more empathy for people that aren't seeing things clearly, and I think hopefully just like generating a more healthy outlook on forums in general. Thanks, Tim. Do you want to meet later?
Yeah, of course. In like
Maybe like at 7 again?
7. Yeah.
Thanks to the guys in the chat. Back here on Wednesday, same time. Peace, guys.
Bye.
Love you, Tim.